As I begin this talk, as Anna pointed out, it's based on a collection that Valerie Kivelson and I put together, which is called Witchcraft in Russia and Ukraine from 1000 to 1900. It is a collection of legal decrees of a variety of types, stories about witchcraft that crop up in the historical literature, as well as they're all translated from Russian, Ukrainian, Polish into English. They also include trials, full trials in some cases, and excerpts from trials that are largely based in archival sources. So these publications have not, or these texts have not been published widely at all, and this is their first appearance. So let me begin by talking about the periodization of this book. We are comparing Russian and Ukrainian witchcraft, and we begin around the year of 1000. This is just after the Christianization of Rus, which extended all the way up from Novgorod down to Kiev and further south to the Black Sea, huge trade route. And the initial documents that we have talk about witchcraft really as practiced by magicians. They're pagans, they're not Christianized yet. There are, in the 13th century, references in law to women who practice witchcraft, but it's not considered such a major problem within the society. The end date is 1900, which may seem to some of you to be really quite late. By 1900, we don't see any persecution of witchcraft. Rather, people who are brought to court are those who attack others for believing in witchcraft. And by 1900, we see witches and sorcerers within the countryside in particular. There's still beliefs in them in the countryside that last into the 20th century. This is not unusual for Western Europe, in fact. There are all sorts of examples of beliefs in witchcraft. This is a painting trying to depict a Russian wedding where sorcery witchcraft was believed to be quite potent. You had to invite the village witch or sorcerer to come to a wedding so as to placate that person's perhaps desire to make you unhappy. In the midst or in between 1000 and 1900, the major period of the witch craze begins in Russia in the late 16th or early 17th centuries. And the trials in both areas, the Ukrainian lands, which are in the 17th century, part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the trials really peak in the second half of the 17th century and first half of the 18th century. They continue into the 1770s. They abate by the 1770s, but do not cease until the middle of the 19th century. You can see that in Russia, there were over 400 of these witchcraft trials, probably involving about 900 people. In the Ukrainian lands, the number is much smaller, just 223 persons accused of witchcraft. And if we look comparatively at Western Europe, what we see happening is that in these areas on the periphery of Europe, You do not have massive witch hunts or mass executions in the Russian and Ukrainian lands. The Russian and Ukrainian Orthodox churches did not mount inquisition like hunts for heretics. They had never developed the terrifying vision of heretical witches involved in a satanic conspiracy. So these trials do not have references to witches' covens, witches' sabbaths, or orgies with the devil. There are no references to marks of the devil or unnatural teats, which, according to European witchcraft belief, witches' demon familiars suckled. In neither area, in neither Russia or the Ukrainian lands, did authorities mount prosecutions of witches, sorcerers, diviners, healers. All charges of witchcraft were brought from below, from individual people who were either victims or thought they were victims of witchcraft or witnesses to witchcraft. And those charges or petitions were brought to secular authorities. In the case of Russia or Muscovy, petitions were submitted to the sovereign's authorities, and the Tsar of Russia interfered or basically managed these trials from the center. He sent his orders out as to what should be done, what questions should be asked, reports back and forth, what kinds of torture, when, and so on. In the Ukrainian lands, people made charges to a magistrate or other town officials under Magdeburg law, or they came before the sovereign's officials. As you can see from these numbers on the screen, there were relatively few executions. And the most extreme execution for witchcraft in both the Ukrainian and Muscovite lands was death by burning. But these executions were rather rare. When they did occur in early modern Russia, for example, the condemned were buried alive inside a small wooden structure, as this icon suggests. They were not then burned at the stake. The judges often noted that they were mitigating the sentence of death by fire to some other kind of execution. And this was particularly true in the Ukrainian lands, where burning at the stake, like in Western Europe, was the death by fire for witches and also individuals who supply poison. When judges mitigated the sentence of death by fire, they, in the Ukrainian lands, they often then imposed a death sentence by sword, using the threat of fire when they applied torture to ascertain the truth. It's interesting that in the Ukrainian lands, death by sword was perceived to be an execution done out of mercy. And you may wonder why that is the case. The distinction between these two death sentences was critical in a Christian society that did not yet practice cremation, because death by fire and the scattering of an individual's ashes symbolized a foretaste of hell and seemingly deprived the witch of participation in the general resurrection of the flesh. By and large, however, the normal punishments for witchcraft were flogging or a fine. What did occur in the 17th and early 18th centuries, first half of the 18th century, was use of torture. And we cannot deny that this torture was anything but merciful. It was more systematically applied in the Russian cases than in the Ukrainian cases. Testimonies were recorded for all instances with or without torture. And sometimes in the Russian cases, someone might be tortured 3 or 4 times, although that was quite extreme, actually. Witnesses, plaintiffs, and defendants had eye-to-eye testimony, so that they had to confront the person that they were accusing, or they had to confront their victim and testify then to whether they had committed harm against a person or not. Plaintiffs, the accused, and witnesses could all be subjected to torture. So, what kinds of questions were asked in these trials? The most common, and these come in Orthodox penitentials as well, are: did you seek the services of a witch, a sorcerer, a diviner? Did you invite the witch, sorcerer, diviner into your home? Do you yourself have knowledge of witchcraft? If so, who taught you? And who else have you taught? Do you know of any witches, sorcerers, and diviners? And of course, questions were more particular to individual cases. When we look at the Ukrainian lands, we see the influence of Western law. And so you can see from this list that the Ukrainian situation was governed by a variety of law codes, the oldest coming from German medieval law and its popular variants of Magdeburg law, which gave considerable autonomy to town officials as different political entities took control over the Ukrainian lands, be they Lithuanian, Polish, and later Russian. The expansion of those towns that were given Magdeburg law took place. Also in operation in the Ukrainian lands was a very famous criminal code imposed by Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, in 1552. And this law was translated into various languages. There are provisions in it to witchcraft. The Lithuanian statutes of the 16th century also have references to witchcraft. And later, courts in the Hetmanate, the independent Cossack Hetmanate, from the middle of the 17th century through much of the 18th century under Russian control, referred to Russian decrees. So this is a map of Ukrainian lands, just to give you a sense of what was happening here. For much of the early modern period, you see that the Ukrainian lands, all of these areas, until 1569, were under the control of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. In the middle of the 16th century, we have the creation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where Poland has more control than Lithuania over these various areas. Then, because of Cossack opposition to Polish rule, and particularly in opposition to Polish Catholicism, we have the creation of a separate Cossack state for a very short period of time that then seeks the protectorate of the Russian lands. And whereas White Bank Ukraine remains under the control of the Polish-Lithuanian states. So in the Ukrainian areas, you have just a convergence of multi-ethnic rulers, occupiers. The lands are also ethnically mixed in terms of population, so that you have Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews living simultaneously together. what is particularly interesting about the Ukrainian and Russian cases are the gender dynamics. Ukraine, uh, possibly because of all of the European influences that are coming in from Roman law, German law, and so on, uh, the Ukraine followed the pattern of much of Western Europe, where roughly 80% of accused witches were women. In the Russian lands, the reverse was true. 75 to 80% of the accused were men. In both areas, despite this difference in the gender dynamics, witch lore remained aloof from Western demonological conceptions and learned misogyny. The Russian Orthodox and Ukrainian Orthodox churches simply did not adopt the Roman Catholic and Protestant um, uh, concentrations on Satan and uh, the the obsession that witchcraft and evil can only come from Satan. As I mentioned before, we don't have witches' covens, we don't have sex with the devil, and so on. Trying to explain why men more prone to being accused in the Russian case has to do with the fact that in the 17th century we have a system of serfdom that prevents a huge amount of mobility, but men were more likely than women to be mobile. They could travel as itinerant merchants, as hunters, as traders, trappers. We have churchmen being accused of sorcery. This does not mean that women didn't practice witchcraft. Uh, Certainly all, both men and women practice witchcraft. All classes believed in the power of witchcraft. And this is extremely important for understanding the 17th and 18th centuries. Just stopping for a moment to review the Russian laws. In the 17th century, instead of major law codes, including strictures against witchcraft, you have various ad hoc decrees issued directly from Moscow, banning a certain witchcraft behavior, requiring a particular action or procedure. And what is really interesting is that there is a major change in the early 18th century when Peter the Great introduces the Western concept of Satanism to Russian witchcraft. In fact, in taking oaths to the Tsar, soldiers and the rest of the population had to uh, basically say that they do not support uh, or indulge in witchcraft, which is really tied to the devil. And because of that introduction of Satanism, we start seeing in the 18th century a few more direct invocations of Satan. You will see more pacts with the devil in the trials, even though they're not particularly widespread. Under Empress Anna in 1731, we see a real preoccupation in the witchcraft trials with fraud and swindling, but it's a really cruel period, applying Peter's cruelest punishments to both practicing sorcerers and their clients. There's slight increase in death sentences, also increase in greater punishments. But decriminalization does begin to take place in the 1770s and 1780s under Catherine the Great, who was a German princess by birth, who brought Western enlightened thinking to Russia, and she demotes witchcraft to a lesser crime and creates decentralized courts of equity in which she says, we must still punish witchcraft if someone believes they're practicing it, because they are really fooling gullible, ignorant people. But we need to have mercy. And so you do not have, of course, the death penalty imposed. The last Russian witch to be executed was in 1744. And Catherine does not take the death penalty back up. She prefers to give her citizens mercy. Cessation of persecution of witches takes place in the late 1860s. And this is true of other areas in Europe, although certainly other areas like England stopped persecuting witches quite a bit earlier. Finding representations, pictorial representations of witches is really very difficult. The very first that we're aware of, this is the first illustration, or one of the first illustrations of the old folklore witch Baba Yaga, here battling a crocodile, and it comes from 1728. The first reference to this old witch hag, a woman in the Russian context, remember when men were more likely to be persecuted, comes in the early 18th century. It's the earliest that we have found. And as you can see in this woodblock print, which would have been produced in an urban area, the witch is wearing fairly androgynous clothing. She does not, you don't see breasts on her. You don't see the female sexuality. She obviously has a tongue on her and has quite a bit of power in battling this crocodile. In the middle of the 18th century, this is the only, this is another woodblock print. And in this case, we see the pendulous breasts of this old witch. This is the only sexualized depiction of Baba Yaga that we have found. And it could be because it's the middle of the 18th century. It could be because of Western influences. Russian pornography is certainly taking off at this time under Western influences. But we also see something in common with Ukrainian portrayals of witches. And this is an icon from Drohobych, Ukraine, from the late 16th century. And here we have the depiction of a witch in which you see her breasts, but not particularly prominent. Her hair is uncovered, which suggests some attachment to sexuality. And on her head, she has a bucket. The same takes place here. This is a charm giver. She has more prominent breasts, suggesting, again, something about women's sexuality, and a bucket on her head as well with with her hair bare. A woman with bare hair was perceived to be sexually available to men. The bucket would refer to milk magic. In the Ukrainian case, a lot of witchcraft was centered on stealing milk from cows or making cows barren. And so we have the depiction of these women in hell. But the most frightening of the depictions of hell is this image. And this is not the image of a witch or a charm giver, but rather this is a depiction of a woman who was believed to kill children, in other words, commit infanticide. And the serpents are embracing her body here. From a very different image, this is a 20th century modern artist's depiction of Ukrainian witchcraft. You see the broom that comes from Western European folklore. You see a witch flying. We do have one case in the Ukrainian examples where they talk about flying, and this is off to another part of Ukraine, and it comes from the late 17th century. But here in the modern depiction, of course, the cow is central, and we're not quite sure why milk magic is so common in Ukraine. It certainly was in the Polish lands. It is not prevalent in the Russian lands. So we come to this question of what was this magic all about? What did this witchcraft consist of? And we have discovered that these were everyday practices of common magic that were meant to inflict harm on individuals and animals or to gain favor with those in authority, be they rulers, judges, or masters, or at least to neutralize that authority. What did they use? They used charms, potions, salt, common things, herbs, grasses, roots of all kinds, water, wax, sweat from clothing, and bathing. They, enchanted these things by enchanting over these common objects. They turned them into something magical. The witchcraft consisted of sending hexes through the air, the wind, outlining a person's footsteps. Causing hernias and swellings was peculiar to Russian witchcraft. In essence, we're talking about societies where modern medicine hadn't yet been discovered. They're linked to lives that are beset by high mortality rates with epidemics of all sorts. While we're living in a pandemic, these people lived with plague, smallpox, typhus, typhoid, fevers of all kinds. They dealt with matters of abuse in hierarchical relationships within the family, the household, the larger community, including the state. And you have the encroachment of serfdom in both the Ukrainian and Russian lands. During times of illnesses and crises, people sought solace and aid, hoping to achieve prosperity, fertility, virility, love, an end to abusive and loveless magic. Men with literacy were particularly suspect in the Russian case if they carried incantations and charms or talismans with them. And here is a 17th century document, which is an excerpt from an incantation of magic. These written documents were perceived to be so dangerous that the Muscovite officials tended to burn them. It's very unusual to find this actual document surviving from the 17th century. We have more instances on the 18th century, from the 18th century. But all levels of Russian and Ukrainian society believed in the powers of magic to help them out of difficulties. And they also believed in the dangerous aspects of magic that could harm them. And so just to take a couple of examples, one of the surprising things that we found in the documents was that beginning in the late 16th century, odes to the Tsar included references to witchcraft, specifically to roots, to herbs, causing harm to the Tsar's family. And so people had to take an oath. All men had to take an oath to the Tsar saying, I will not harm the Tsar or his family with roots, with thoughts of malevolence and evil. And they go on and on and on. By the first quarter of the 17th century, that reference to witchcraft is taken out of the general oath, but all servitors at the court of the Tsar, depending on their particular role at the court, had to take a specific oath that talked about not putting noxious herbs and roots into various accoutrements that the Tsar had. And so this is just a portion of it. And this is from the person who was in charge of the royal stables. He had to take this oath and make a kiss on the cross binding himself to protecting the health of the sovereign Tsar. And you have a description of every horse, every fancy, the riding crops, the gloves, mention of bridles, the fringe, the sleigh, the carpet, the chamber pot, every kind of horse, and so on. And this is basically saying, making an oath, I am not going to harm the Tsar in any way or order anyone to commit evil or witchcraft against the Tsar. And then for a final example, just to give you a sense of what might take place in one of these trials, this from the Ukraine, from the middle of the 18th century. All we have in this case is the testimony of a young man who had been a laborer and had been sexually harassed by his mistress. This is one of these inversions where women in power could, of course, also take advantage of male servants. And what happened over several years was that this woman kept demanding sex from her servant. He obliged, he keeps saying that he committed sin with her for years on end, but he kept running away. And each time he did so, she somehow was able to bring him back. And the only way he could explain this was through witchcraft. And he describes then his ladyship's turning to her wet nurse to employ witchcraft. Sometimes she scattered hot coals under the threshold. Sometimes she ran naked around the house, evoking that nakedness, of course, of hell. When she scattered hot coals on a shirt under the threshold, she would put a light candle end to the shirt as if divining. If the shirt didn't catch fire, it meant that I would come back as her ladyship hoped. So this gives you a little taste of what happens in these trials. They really tell us how people believed, how they lived their lives, and how they lived within their political settings. And I'll stop there so that we can turn to Anatoly for his commentary and open up the question to people. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christine, so much for this wonderful exposition through centuries. So now I'll invite Anatoly to give your comments and questions. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. Before we start, just to remind everyone that you can send questions in the chat, or then after Anatoly's comments and Christine's replies, you can raise your hand, and then we'll try to find you and unmute you if you want to pose the question directly. Thanks.
Okay. That was great. Thank you so much, Anna, for inviting me to comment. And thank you, Christine, for such a fascinating presentation and a great book. I'm going to be very brief because there are so many of you, and I want to make sure that as many of you, as many people as possible are able to ask Christine questions. So I'm going to talk for 7, 8, 9 minutes, something. Okay, maybe 10. Okay, so now, as Anna knows, when I was asked to talk about Christine and Valerie Kivelson's book, my first reaction was, because I work on the Stalin era and on the post-Stalin era, that this might be a bit far afield. But I want to say that I'm incredibly grateful to have been asked because I've learned so much from this book. And really after, and Anna knows this, after a couple of minutes of thinking over her proposal, I realized actually how relevant witchcraft is, the persecution of witches, to some of the issues that I'm myself interested in. One of them being the terror and the persecution of people during the terror in the late 1930s in the Soviet Union. So it became clear to me very quickly that this book, while it covers a lot of ground chronologically from the 11th century to 1900, that it should be of interest and read by people who are interested in the 20th century, not to mention the 21st century. And that's because the legacies of witchcraft are very much still with us. And this is not only because of the persistence of things like superstition, many of us are probably superstitious, but also because of our political discourses. And Christine mentioned how witchcraft is something that persisted in Western Europe in the 20th century. She mentioned this in passing early in her presentation. And it's, of course, a discourse that metaphorically persists in many of our political cultures. I myself sort of am feeling superstitious and, not wanting to name certain people who are certain political figures who are somewhat behind us for fear of incantation, who themselves used the language of witch hunt and so on. And I wonder, and metaphors aside, there's also quite literal phenomena that are still with us. And I wonder, for example, Christine, I don't mean to disclose your location, but Christine is very close to Capitol Hill in Washington, DC. And I wonder if when she began this project, she would think that the center of not only her neighborhood, but of American political life would be occupied by a male witch in January of 2021. So I'll circle back to this issue of the present, not the 21st century, early 2021, but rather Russia's 20th century. When we get to I get to some questions. Now, what I want to do as far as comments are concerned, I'm going to be very brief. I'm going to summarize the book by making 4 very basic points, and I'm going to be recapping some of what Christine said here. There's probably two key points that Christine and her co-author Valerie Kivelson make in the introduction, and those 2 key points are related to the differences between witchcraft in Russia and Ukraine on the one hand, and the West, in quotes, on the other. And the first difference is and Christine touched upon this, of course, that in Russia, there is an absence of a pact with the devil, or a relative absence. And this leads in the Russian and Ukrainian case to a smaller number of trials, witch hunts, and executions, since witches are not seen as threatening as they are seen in Central and Western Europe. That said, and Christine ended with this, the magic itself is ubiquitous. So you have less persecution. However, the magic is ubiquitous in these cultures. The second key difference is the exceptional gender profile of the accused. And here, this is also related to the absence of the pact with the devil. And here, what Christine and Valerie Kivelson are talking about is Russia and not Ukraine. For Ukraine doesn't have this exceptional gender profile. So the witches are men. And this picture, however, while there's this general division drawn in the introduction between Russia and the West, Christine and Val do a great job of complicating this division by talking about some exceptions, even west of Russia. So Finland, Estonia, Normandy, Iceland, I believe there were others, also resemble the Russian case where you have male witches. However, in the mid-19th century, there's a change. In the mid-19th century, the gender profile, as the co-authors explain, becomes more like the Ukrainian and more like the more widespread European gender profile. And here I'll sort of jump ahead. I have a couple other points, but I'll jump ahead. This is one question that I wanted to ask. What is it about the mid-19th century that leads to the change in the gender profile? So I said I was going to make 4 points to recap the book. Those were the first two, these two differences. Another one is there's, I mean, for me, for somebody who works in the 20th century, where ostensibly there's so much change, and there is a lot of very meaningful change, obviously. One theme that Christine and Val draw out is that there's an incredible amount of change on the cultural and political level. The cultural, legal, and political level. However, on the level of the magic itself, over these 9 centuries, they find an incredible amount of persistence, the persistence of practices. The fourth, and I just found this, the fourth point I wanted to make, and I just found this to be a really useful reminder, this comparative frame that they create between the West and Russia and Ukraine. In discussing that comparative frame, they do a really good job of reminding us that Western Europe, or Western Europe, which we often tend to see as normative, is actually very unusual if you take into account all of geographical Europe. And here, there's a discussion in the introduction about how the timeline for when persecutions increase and when persecutions decrease, that Russia actually looks a lot, Russia and Ukraine look a lot like most of Europe, as opposed to the sort of far northwest. And I found this to be a very good reminder of just how, sort of a check on our seeing as Western Europe as normative. So now what I wanted to do is quickly pose 4 questions. One of them I've already posed, about the gender profile of witches changing in the mid-19th century. The second one is, and here I'll quickly quote on page 3 and 4 of the introduction. The co-authors write that the devil and his demons figured prominently in Orthodox understandings of sin, and appeared in Last Judgment icons and frescoes. But this was not a devil with the frightening unitary power that Catholic and Protestant theologians ascribe to him. And here I was wondering if Christine might be interested in telling us a little bit more about the image of the devil in the Russian case. And one of the, I was very interested in the book, and I've checked out, I promise everybody I'll return them, because I believe I have all of Christine's work from the library in my apartment. Possessed, an earlier book she has on witchcraft. I also have Valerie Kivelson's Desperate Magic here, which I'll return as well. But that question, I'm guessing, is related to this book, The Possessed. The third question is, I'm wondering about the non-European context. That is, the book is framed as there's such an excellent discussion of how Russia and Ukraine relate to the rest of Europe. And then at the very beginning of the introduction, there's this very expansive and incredibly informative frame that includes places like South Africa, I believe Indonesia, Latin America, and I'm wondering how that larger context, what kind of light that larger context throws on the Russian case. And the last thing that I want to say, and I already brought this up, here I circle back to more contemporary times, and what I mean here is the 20th century, particularly the 1930s. And I already raised this with Christine. Christine and Val write, and this is in the beginning that I just referred to, where they have this expansive picture of witchcraft all over the world. And they draw not only on history here, but various disciplines, including anthropology. And they write, anthropologists now recognize how seamlessly witchcraft and modernity interconnect, and with what horrifying results. And modernity didn't begin in Russia, of course, in 1917. It began much earlier. And I began to ask myself, and this is why I've checked out all of these books, I began to ask myself about the role of witchcraft practices after 1917. And I mean this in two senses. First, the persistence of witchcraft itself among the lower classes. So if you have this incredible continuity over 9 centuries, what happens to it in the 20th century? And then not the persistence of witchcraft per se, but the persistence of practices like slander, which Christine and Val write about later in the book, and persistences of persecution. They write, for example, in the introduction about how there are spikes in formal legal prosecution during the early modern period, because this is a time of, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here now, because this is a time of great state building. And so here in the Soviet period, you also have an incredible amount of state building and an incredible amount of persecution. And it led me to think about the links between these phenomena. Now, what I was particularly struck with at the links of these phenomena is, I already talked to Christine about, maybe somebody else is interested in it, but they write quite a bit about roots. Every now and then in the book, you come across how witches are placing roots all about in order to cast spells on people. And what's interesting, I found this language of roots, karishki, in the discourse of the terror. And I found very odd constructions, including rastavlyat karishki, which is about spreading roots. And it's about, this phrase is used in the context of particularly sort of evil people who are connected to Trotsky, who are placing their followers are roots who are being placed about. And I began to wonder about the relationship that this discourse might have with the discourse of witchcraft. And now I've definitely talked for more than 7, 8, 9 minutes, so I want to wrap up and just pose those questions. And you know what, Christine, if you'd like, you can just respond to one of them, and then we can open up, because there are just so many people who I'm sure have great questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anatoly, for taking the time to look at my various writings and also Val's writings on witchcraft, magic, and possession. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your commentary. I say there are lots of questions in the chat, and one predominant theme that's running through them, although it's not the only one, has to do, of course, with the striking gender differences in the Russian and Ukrainian cases. And so I think I'll start with that one simply because it may begin to answer some of people's questions. And certainly Anatoly's point that there were male witches persecuted in Western Europe, and particularly the northern lands. And so they're the Nordic areas, and of course, we do have Varangians, Swedes, and people from the Nordic lands coming in to the Ukrainian lands in the 9th century already. And so there are certainly influences there. In the case of Muscovy, certainly men, as you have a population that is being really entrenched in serfdom, men can be perceived to be threatening. They could be runaway serfs. They may, and as a result, they're perceived already to be, endangering this social order that they really believe is necessary to keep the crops growing and so on. But also, what's different in the Ukrainian case here is that literacy is much better developed in the Ukrainian lands than it is in the Muscovite lands. We think that only 11% of the population could read and perhaps write. We don't know. The literacy rates are really very low. And so the power of writing and having these talismans, these these incantations written out, sometimes in booklets, are really perceived to be dangerous. And there's a lot of concern that this could upset the social order, that action, there's almost a fear that no one is safe from witchcraft, including the Tsar and his family, right? And that fear already starts in the 16th century, particularly in the reign of Ivan IV. There's a real fear of witchcraft, and this is true of Elizabethan England. I mean, it's that there are lots of similarities here, but the gender differences are stark. We speculate that Orthodoxy has a role to play in this because we don't have a strong demonological theology where Satan is at the center of things. One of the questioners asks, and very rightly so, about how demons were portrayed in both lands, and also points to the fact that the devil played a role, obviously, in Byzantine writings, and demons were ever present. Part of the problem has to do with the fact that we used to assume that everything that the Byzantines had done, had written, had everything was supposedly translated into Slavic, into Old Church Slavonic, and it was adopted and practiced as it was sort of received knowledge. What we're finding, particularly in the Russian case, is the Russians often went their own way. There's also a problem in the fact that scenes of the Last Judgment in churches, in Orthodox Russian churches, were largely destroyed in the 18th century, as there was later 18th century, as there was an attempt to humanize and make Orthodoxy less frightening. So the kinds of materials that we have left over are saint stories, where certainly demon possession takes place. I'm an authority on demon possession. Demon possession is certainly there, but it's not sexualized as it is in Western Europe. In fact, one of the biggest trials of the 17th century, mid-17th century, is in the town of Luch. Most of the victims are women, and they perceive themselves to be bewitched by sorcerers. And they talk about being possessed, and that some of them have actually demons within them. Later, you see this demonic possession through the 18th century and through the 19th century as well. In the medieval period and early modern period, men could also be possessed by demons. So it wasn't specific to women. It becomes feminized in the course of the 18th century and early 19th century. Some of this has to do with Peter the Great's demoting demon possession as something that is maybe not real, that may be fraudulent activity. And we also see, as Anatoly mentioned, that feminization of witchcraft is taking place by actually the end of the 18th century. And certainly by the middle of the 19th century, you do see a predominance of women, but the male sorcerers don't disappear. That doesn't mean that they're not there. But Western influences are coming through. From where? From Poland, from Ukraine, literature that's being translated, and the Western notions of women's sexuality and consort with the devil comes into these areas, so that by the early 19th century in Ukrainian writing, Gogol, for example, although he wrote in Russian, but also other Ukrainian writers and also Russian writers, we have invocations to Bald Mountain. We have invocations, suggestions of orgies with the devil. That's all new, that's Western. So there are lots of influences that take place in all of that. And as far as roots are concerned, I think it's fascinating that you see this fear of roots and natural lore in the 1930s during the terror. And we have to keep in mind that most Russians throughout, they still do. They grow things. Their gardens are incredibly important for their family's survival. They're incredibly well knowledgeable about the use of roots and herbs for healing. You know, I grew up with a grandmother who was from Ukraine and, you know, used cabbage, wormwood, lots of herbal remedies for basic everyday practices. And that's what we have to understand, is that in the 17th century and earlier, people were so in tune with nature, they understood the properties of different plants, and some plants are dangerous. You know, mandrake, you could use it as an abortifacient, but it has, it's deadly if you take it in large quantities. They knew about these things and they owned them. And some people were then perceived to do evil. So that's my way of sort of trying to answer a few of the questions, and then perhaps we should open up to the chat room.